Australia is promising something much less than the United States, wildly less than any European country, less than Mexico, less than Brazil, less than China. And it's a pretty sad thing. I'm a great Australian fan, and I'm really sad that she should be right at the back of the pack and also pretending she was ahead. It's very sad.
You say less than China. The way that's been characterised here is that China is going to continue to increase emissions. They're going to not peak until around 2030, which suggests that, well, what's the point in Australia doing anything more aggressive when China is going to keep putting out carbon pollution like that?
Well, look, we've shoved most of our manufacturing to China, and it's not surprising that her pollution has increased. But she now does have a peak date. She's doing more to invest in non-fossil fuels than any other country in the world. We expect that she will actually peak much earlier than she says. She certainly believes in climate change, and what she's doing is remarkable given where she started from. And the sadness is that many other countries are doing very well indeed, working really hard at it. And Australia is going to go to the Paris talks with one of the least ambitious targets. And yet this great country, is more vulnerable than many countries, as we're seeing now, with the really serious threats of peaking heat.
What about the situation in the United Kingdom? I suppose broadly comparable to Australia in terms of our position in the world, our point of industrialisation, probably more of a relevant comparison to the UK than it is perhaps to China. What are the targets there?
Well, we're at 40 when you're at 25. That's the fact. We are going to cut our emissions by 80% by the year 2050. We have a programme to do that, which is statutory. In other words, it's legally binding. The Climate Change Committee is a legally binding committee. We've already put forward and have had accepted all the programme towards that up to 2027. I'm now working with my committee on 2027 to 2032. The government is entirely supportive, as is the opposition. And the government spending over the period up to 2020 is spending £7.6 billion on ensuring that we are in line to decarbonise the whole of our electricity system. So we are doing very, very much more than Australia, as indeed is the whole of the rest of the European Union, as is Switzerland and Norway, as is Mexico. Even the proposals that look as if they're coming from South Africa are better than those which are being proposed by Australia. It's very sad.
You mentioned, John, the bipartisan consensus around this issue. Obviously a very big difference to what we've seen in Australia in the last 5 years or so when that bipartisan approach broke down. From what you understand of the Australian situation from conversations that you've had, do you see a return to a consensus position with a change of Prime Minister?
Well, there ought to be. I mean, Conservatives around the world are, of course, very much in the lead of battling against climate change. I mean, David Cameron in Britain, Angela Merkel in Germany, two of the major leaders, leading parties not dissimilar in attitudes to the coalition. They are very clearly fighting this battle. And Malcolm Turnbull is a person whom I respect, I know, and hope very much that he'll be able to help his party to accept the science. The science is now absolute. I mean, nobody really in the world disagrees with the fact that climate change is happening, that human beings are causing it. And if we don't work together to do something about it, then frankly, we are going to find ourselves in a really serious position, not just our future, not just children and grandchildren, but ourselves. As we've seen, I mean, just today, a friend of mine has been evacuated from South Carolina, where he was there with his daughter, who went to college there, evacuated by the Red Cross because of the disastrous floods. Been a drought for 7 years in California. The floods, the water coming down now is absolutely enormous. The extremes of weather, which you are experiencing here in Australia, are going to get worse and worse.
All right, let's bring in some questions and comments from the panels. David.
John, I think it's hard to disagree with your assessment that Australia is at the back of the pack in terms of its aspiration around emissions reduction. Can you talk a little bit about the other end of the scale? What are the countries that are adopting best practice? What are the types of policy approaches that are being embraced that Australia could look to if it were to improve its targets around emission reduction?
Well, first of all, of course, encouraging all sorts of non-fossil fuel generation. And the attack on wind power and solar power, which we've had here, is rather sad, because you've got wonderful opportunities for solar power and a good deal of opportunities too for wind power. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is energy efficiency. There's a huge amount we can do. We don't want to be I'm not a Puritan, I'm a Catholic. I'm in favour of people enjoying themselves. I don't want a world in which we are miserable. All we can do, if we were sensible about energy efficiency, we could do all the things we do now with half the energy that we use. That's the second thing. Third thing we can do is have a long-term plan so that fix yourself. Say that in 2050, like Britain and the European Union generally and many other countries, you're going to cut your emissions by 80%. And have a proper programme going towards that so that it's cost effective. Have bring back the Independent Climate Change Committee to do that work. Let Tim Flannery do that work properly and let it work so that the world can see that you're being independent, you're following the science and you're doing it in a cost effective way.
Let's bring in Joan over in Perth. Joe.
Hello.
Hi.
John, look, one of the things that we need to talk about is the fact that actually Australia's not behind the pack if we're looking at other things like the fact that our population growth is faster than all of the other Western nations, that our population density is lower, our transport costs are higher, that our industries are heavily dependent on exporting high emission products. And our largest export industry is coal. So in terms of what Australia can do, we've already done all of the easy things that are possible. We've put in a great effort so far. And people have got to acknowledge our population density, our population growth rate, which is faster than all of the other Western nations virtually that we're discussing. So we also don't have much capacity politically to do nuclear or hydro, which are the renewable forms of energy which actually produce significant amounts of energy. Wind and solar, which, as you say, in Australia, we're well placed to do them, still only about 1% of our total energy use. It's very small. And there's not much capacity to increase it. We've already done the easy things that are there to be done. So, and in as much as you say China's on board with this, China's going to keep increasing emissions till 2030. And that was when emissions were always going to decline for them when their population peaked. So they're actually really not doing anything. It's all very token. It's the same with India.
Let's get John's response to that, the notion that Australia should be a special case.
Well, first of all, the Chinese argument is nonsense. The fact of the matter is her emissions are great, not because of her population, but because she is in the position of exporting all the things that we used to make at home are being made by China. So we've exported our emissions to her. Secondly, she's going to peak well before 2030. She's a very sensible, organised political machine, so they don't promise things in advance. You watch what happens at the great negotiations in December. She will announce very much earlier peaking. She's going to be able to do that. At the same time, she has the thing that she's got a mechanism now, a kind of cap and trade system, which is in operation in 6 different areas. It'll be universal, nationwide very soon. She's doing extremely well, and it's just untrue to say that she's not, and it's used as an excuse. Second thing is, climate change isn't going to wait for Australia. The climate change is going to happen. Australia either plays her part in it, or in fact she's in a worse position. And the countries you're exporting to are going to increasingly say, we're not having this. We're not everyone else bearing it. Britain has the fastest growing population in Europe. We have a very significant population increase. But what we have said is, whatever the population is, whatever the problem is, we have got to do our part, and our part is to meet what everyone else is going to have to do as well, which is to cut those emissions by 80%. All right, sitting there saying you're a special case, the fact of the matter is climate change doesn't do special cases. Climate change is happening, it's going to hit you hard, and there's no point in saying, well, I'm very sorry, we've got awful difficulties. You have difficulties, everyone else is willing to help, but for goodness sake, you've already done less than other people. I was at Kyoto. The arguments of the Australians in Kyoto were unacceptable. You didn't take on anything like the burden of other advanced countries, so don't pretend you're doing better. You're not, and everyone else outside knows that. And you won't get it right until we're actually honest with ourselves. Britain was way behind on, for example, non-fossil fuels. We had very little renewable energy, but we've worked extremely hard. 1% is a disgrace. Other countries are up. We're already getting into double figures when we started, just like you, in the same bad position.
John, a quick final question from Anne Davies.
John, I don't know if you've had a chance to put these views directly to our Prime Minister. Given his political problems, what advice would you give him? Is it possible to do this in 2 steps, perhaps? Or will the world feel more confident if we have a more developed plan on renewables?
I think that the world would be extremely pleased if Australia showed that it was thinking seriously about trying to bring the parties together to find a common view. I think Malcolm Turnbull is a remarkable man. He's respected throughout the world. He's got a wonderful opportunity to do this. He's got real difficulties, of course, within his party. But in order to do this, I think if he showed that the Australian people were willing to try to do something more than they have offered, that they would be prepared to come back with something more stronger, that they could really try to contribute when it comes to the meeting in Paris, I think everybody would find themselves wanting to help him, because we don't want Australia to look right outside the world community, which it does at the moment.